I still remember the day I moved into that old brick apartment building on Maple Street. It was a charming place with high ceilings, wooden floors that creaked with every step, and windows that let in just the right amount of afternoon sunlight. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly populated by young professionals and a few older residents who'd been there for decades. There was a small coffee shop on the corner that became my morning ritual, and a park just 2 blocks away where I'd often go to read or just watch people pass by. It was the kind of place that felt like home almost immediately, which was exactly what I needed after moving to a new city. My name is Alex, 28 years old, with a job in graphic design that I could mostly do remotely. I'd moved here for a change of scenery after a particularly difficult breakup, hoping that new surroundings would help clear my head. I didn't know anyone in town yet, which made those first few weeks both exciting and terribly lonely. The only person I had any regular contact with was my landlord, Morgan, who was about 35 and owned the entire building, having inherited it from family, as I later learned. Morgan lived in one of the apartments on the top floor and managed the property personally, which was unusual but refreshing compared to the faceless property management companies I'd dealt with in the past. Our relationship was friendly but professional. Morgan was attentive to maintenance requests, and occasionally we'd chat if we ran into each other in the hallway or outside the building. There was something about Morgan that I found instantly likable: a warm smile, an easy laugh, and eyes that seemed genuinely interested when asking how I was settling in. But I never thought much beyond that. After all, mixing business with pleasure seemed like a recipe for complications I didn't need. It was about 3 months after I moved in when everything changed. I was working from home on a Tuesday afternoon, deeply focused on a design project with my headphones on, when a knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered pretending I wasn't home. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the door to find Morgan standing there, looking slightly apologetic. "Hey, Alex. Sorry to bother you," Morgan said, holding up what looked like a newly cut key. "I just got this spare made for your apartment. Building regulations. We need to have access in case of emergencies." Morgan looked different that day, more casual than usual in jeans and a fitted t-shirt that highlighted a physique I hadn't really noticed before. Hair slightly tousled, as if it had been a busy day running errands around town. I found myself momentarily distracted by the small details: a silver watch on the left wrist, the faint scent of something woody and pleasant, the way Morgan's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when smiling. "No problem," I replied, trying to focus on the key rather than my suddenly racing thoughts. "That makes sense. Actually," Morgan continued, turning the key over in hand, "I wanted to make sure it works properly. Would you mind if we tested it together? I've had issues with some of the copies from that hardware store downtown." There was something in the way Morgan asked, a hint of hesitation, perhaps even nervousness, that made me wonder if there was more to this request than just testing a key. But I quickly dismissed the thought. This was my landlord, after all, being responsible about building security. "Sure, we can test it," I said, grabbing my phone from the coffee table. "Now." Morgan nodded, seeming relieved. "If you're not too busy. It'll just take a minute." As we left my apartment, I locked the door behind us out of habit. Morgan smiled at this, careful and security conscious. "I appreciate that in a tenant," Morgan said, with what I could have sworn was a playful tone. We walked down the hallway toward the stairs, and I realized this was the first time we'd spent more than a few minutes in each other's company. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily as we descended the stairs and headed outside. Morgan asked about my work, and I found myself enthusiastically explaining my latest project. There was something flattering about the genuine interest Morgan showed, asking follow-up questions and seeming impressed by my descriptions. "So you're basically creating visual identities for companies that don't even exist yet?" Morgan asked as we walked around the building toward what I assumed was the back entrance. "Exactly," I replied. "Startups need to look established even when they're just beginning. It's all about creating the right impression. Like first impressions between people," Morgan said, glancing at me with a smile that made me momentarily lose my train of thought. "Right," I managed to respond. "Though people are usually more complex than logos." Morgan laughed, a warm, genuine sound that I immediately wanted to hear again. "Some people, maybe. Others are pretty straightforward." "And which are you?" I asked before I could stop myself. There was a brief pause as Morgan considered the question. "I'd like to think I'm an open book, but Morgan's voice trailed off as we reached a door I hadn't noticed before. Here we are. This is actually my apartment. I figured we could test the key here first, since it's the same lock system. I was surprised. I knew Morgan lived in the building, but I hadn't expected this detour. The apartment was on the ground floor, around the back of the building, with a small garden space visible through a side window. I thought you lived on the top floor. I asked, confused. I did until last month. Decided to switch to this unit. It has garden access, and I've been wanting to try my hand at growing vegetables, Morgan explained, gesturing toward the small patch of greenery. Plus, it's easier to respond to maintenance issues when I'm right here on the ground floor. As Morgan inserted the key into the lock, I noticed our proximity, standing close enough that I could detect that pleasant scent again, something like sandalwood mixed with clean laundry. I became acutely aware of my breathing, trying to keep it even and natural despite the sudden flutter in my chest. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and Morgan looked pleased. Good sign. Let's try it from the inside too, just to be thorough. I followed Morgan into the apartment, immediately struck by how different it was from mine despite having the same basic layout. Where my place was still somewhat sparse, with boxes I hadn't yet unpacked, Morgan's home was fully realized. Warm colors, bookshelves lined with an eclectic mix of titles, plants thriving on every available surface, and art on the walls that looked like original pieces rather than mass-produced prints. Your place is beautiful, I said honestly, taking it all in. Makes mine look like a storage unit in comparison. Morgan laughed again. That sound I was quickly becoming fond of. It took me years to get it this way. And honestly, half of these plants were rescue missions from tenants who moved out and didn't want to take them along. I moved toward a particularly impressive fern. Well, they seem happy here. Plants are good judges of character, Morgan said, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. They know when they're in a good place. There was something in those words, or perhaps in the way they were said, that made the moment feel suddenly charged with possibility. But before I could respond, Morgan turned back to the door. Let's check the lock from this side. We both moved toward the door, and Morgan handed me the key. You try it. Our fingers brushed during the exchange, and I felt a jolt of electricity that seemed to linger. Focusing on the task at hand, I inserted the key into the lock from the inside. It turned smoothly, but as I tried to turn the handle, something felt wrong. That's strange, I said, jiggling the handle. It's not opening. Morgan reached around me to try, our arms touching in the process. You're right. Let me see. We spent the next few minutes trying different techniques, turning the key while pulling the door, pushing while turning, jiggling the handle in various ways, but nothing worked. We were, it seemed, locked inside. Well, this is awkward, Morgan said finally, turning to face me with a mix of embarrassment and amusement. I think the mechanism might be stuck. This sometimes happens with the older locks in the building. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. So the landlord and tenant are locked inside the landlord's apartment. Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. Morgan's face relaxed into a smile. Or the start of a good story, depending on how you look at it. That comment hung in the air between us, full of unspoken possibilities. I should call my maintenance guy, Morgan continued, pulling out a phone. He has master keys and knows how to fix these old locks when they act up. As Morgan made the call, I took the opportunity to look around the apartment more closely. The personal touches revealed so much about my landlord that I hadn't known. Framed photos showing Morgan hiking in beautiful landscapes, bookshelves containing everything from classic literature to modern poetry to practical guides on building restoration, a guitar in the corner that looked well used rather than decorative. Good news and bad news, Morgan announced after ending the call. Carlos can come fix it, but he's across town at another property and won't be here for at least an hour. An hour? I repeated, suddenly aware that I was essentially trapped in my landlord's apartment for the foreseeable future. Morgan looked concerned. I'm really sorry about this. If you need to get back to work. Actually, I admitted, a break might be good. I've been staring at the same design for hours. Relief washed over Morgan's face. In that case, can I offer you something to drink? Coffee, tea, water. I might even have some wine if you're feeling adventurous. Tea would be great, I replied, following Morgan to the kitchen area, which was separated from the living room by a breakfast bar. As Morgan filled a kettle and took mugs from a cabinet, I leaned against the counter, struck by how comfortable this felt despite the unusual circumstances. There was an ease between us that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. "So," Morgan said, placing tea bags in the mugs, "now that I've accidentally imprisoned you in my home, I should probably make the most of this opportunity to get to know my newest tenant better." I laughed. "Is this how you break the ice with all your tenants? Lock them in until they share their life story?" "Only the interesting ones," Morgan replied with a wink that sent an unexpected thrill through me. The kettle whistled, and as Morgan poured the hot water, steam rose between us like the beginning of something taking shape. We moved to the couch with our mugs, sitting close enough to talk comfortably, but with enough space to maintain a professional boundary, though that boundary was beginning to feel increasingly arbitrary. "So what brought you to this city?" Morgan asked, blowing gently on the tea. "You mentioned you moved here recently." I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Fresh start, I guess. I was in a relationship that ended, not great. Needed a change of scenery." Morgan nodded understandingly. "I know that feeling. Sometimes new walls help build new perspectives." "Is that why you're in property management?" "Philosophy about walls," I teased. Morgan laughed. "Actually, I never planned to be a landlord. I was studying architecture when my uncle passed away and left me this building. It was supposed to be a temporary thing while I figured out what to do with it, but then I realized I enjoyed the work, meeting different people, maintaining this beautiful old structure, being part of a community." "That's actually really nice," I said sincerely. "Most landlords I've had were faceless corporations or people who seem to actively dislike their tenants." "Well, it helps that I'm selective about who lives here," Morgan said, looking at me with an intensity that made me wonder if there had been more to my application approval than just good credit. As we continued talking, the hours stretched before us, filled with stories and laughter. Morgan told me about growing up in a small town, about dreams of designing sustainable housing, about the challenges of maintaining a century-old building with modern expectations. I shared stories about my design work, my previous city life, my hopes for building something new here. There was a moment, about 40 minutes into our conversation, when something shifted. We had moved from safe topics to more personal territory, past relationships, disappointments, hopes for the future. Morgan was in the middle of describing a particularly disastrous date when our eyes locked, and the laughter between us transformed into something electric. "It's strange," Morgan said softly, "how sometimes you can know someone for years and never really connect, and other times it happens almost immediately." I finished, my heart racing. Morgan nodded, setting down the now empty mug. "Exactly. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged with potential. I became hyper-aware of everything. The soft fabric of the couch beneath my fingers, the afternoon light casting warm patterns across the floor, the slight movement as Morgan shifted closer to me. "I should probably confess something," Morgan said, looking slightly guilty. "The key wasn't really the issue. I mean, yes, we needed to test it, but, I prompted, holding my breath. "But I could have just tested it myself. I wanted an excuse to spend some time with you. Get to know you outside of our landlord-tenant relationship." The admission hung in the air between us. I should have been annoyed at the mild deception, but instead, I felt a surge of pleasure knowing that Morgan had been thinking about me too. "And the locked door?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Was that part of your master plan as well?" Morgan laughed, looking genuinely embarrassed. "Absolutely not. That was just bad luck, or good luck, depending on how you look at it." I smiled, feeling bold. "I'm leaning toward good luck." There was a moment where time seemed suspended, both of us aware that we were on the edge of something that would change our dynamic completely. Morgan reached out slowly, giving me plenty of time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The simple touch sent electricity through me. "I've been wanting to do that since you opened your door today," Morgan admitted quietly. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door, startling us both. We jumped apart like guilty teenagers. "That must be Carlos," Morgan said, looking both relieved and disappointed as we stood up. Sure enough, the maintenance man made quick work of the stubborn lock, explaining something about the mechanism that I barely registered as I tried to process what had just happened, or almost happened, between Morgan and me. As Carlos left, Morgan and I stood awkwardly in the doorway, the spell of our forced confinement broken, but the connection between us undeniably changed. "So," Morgan said finally, "the key works." I laughed at the absurd understatement. "Yes, it does. I'm sorry again about the lock malfunction. I'm not, I said boldly, surprising myself. It was enlightening. Morgan's smile was slow and full of promise. Maybe we could continue our conversation sometime, without the pretense of building maintenance. I'd like that, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. As I walked back to my apartment, I couldn't help but reflect on how unexpected life could be. I had moved to this city looking for a fresh start, never imagining that I might find a connection with the person who handed me my keys on that first day. There was something both terrifying and exhilarating about the possibilities that lay ahead. The uncertainty of exploring feelings for someone who was technically my landlord, the vulnerability of opening myself up again after being hurt, the simple joy of discovering a connection when I least expected it. Later that evening, as I was making dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. In case of emergency, or coffee, or dinner. Morgan. I saved the number with a smile, already composing my reply. Whatever happened next, I knew that a simple spare key had unlocked something far more significant than just a door. It had opened a possibility, a chance at connection, at understanding, at whatever might develop between two people who found each other when neither was looking. As I typed my response, accepting Morgan's dinner invitation for the following evening, I felt a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced in a long time. Life really did have a way of surprising you when you least expected it. Sometimes, apparently, all it took was a landlord with a spare key and an hour locked in an apartment to change everything. Total _char_count, 17,823.